Arthur Kingston was a man who had it all. At least that's what everyone believed. As one of the wealthiest and most influential businessmen in the city, Arthur had built an empire from the ground up. His mansion, nestled on a hill in the most exclusive part of town, was a monument to his success. The sleek luxury cars parked in his driveway were a testament to his financial prowess, and his office tower in the heart of the city was the crown jewel of his vast holdings. On the surface, Arthur Kingston had it all. Yet despite his outward success, Arthur found himself troubled. There was a hollow feeling inside him, a growing emptiness that he couldn't shake. The wealth that he had worked so hard for seemed to offer little satisfaction beyond a fleeting sense of accomplishment. In fact, the more he achieved, the more he began to feel distanced from the world around him. The mansion, the cars, the power, none of it seemed to bring him closer to the people he once knew or the world he once belonged to. It had all started years ago, when Arthur had been a poor child living in a small apartment in the rougher part of town. He remembered the nights when he'd lie awake, hungry and cold, wondering if life would ever get better. He remembered the harsh stares of others, the way he was treated as invisible, no more than a shadow on the street. And yet, through sheer determination, he had risen from those humble beginnings to become one of the city's elite. But as the years went by, Arthur's success had begun to feel like a cage. He had created a fortress of wealth around himself, but in doing so, he had isolated himself from the very humanity that had once driven him. He couldn't help but wonder, had people always been this indifferent to the suffering of others? More troubling still was the question, did people treat the poor differently simply because of how they looked? One morning, after weeks of brooding over these questions, Arthur came up with a radical idea. He would find out for himself. He would leave the comfort of his mansion behind and experience the world as a man without wealth. He would disguise himself as a homeless person and sit outside his own gates to see how people would react to him. The experiment. Arthur knew it would be a strange and difficult endeavor, but something deep within him urged him to move forward. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he had a feeling it would change him forever. On a chilly autumn morning, he put his plan into motion. He dug out an old, worn jacket from his closet, a relic from his younger days. The sleeves were frayed, the fabric faded, and the collar was tattered. He paired it with a pair of ragged jeans, shoes that had long lost their luster, and a cap that had seen better days. He scribbled a simple message on a piece of cardboard, "Need help." His handwriting shaky, as though the words themselves had to be coaxed out of him. Stepping out of the front gate of his mansion, he sat down on the cold pavement just a few feet away from his sprawling estate. Behind him, the mansion loomed like a distant world. The gates, usually so grand and imposing, now seemed almost suffocating, like an iron barrier separating him from everything else. For the first few hours, nothing happened. People walked by, some quickening their pace when they saw him, others glancing at him without a second thought. It didn't take long for Arthur to realize that most of the people walking past weren't even seeing him. They saw his tattered clothes, they saw a homeless man, but they didn't see a human being. As the morning turned to afternoon, the indifference became harder to ignore. A young woman jogging by glanced at him briefly but didn't stop, her earbuds firmly in place. A couple walked past, the man quickly turning his head when he saw Arthur, the woman clutching her purse tightly as though afraid it might be snatched away. Then came the group of teenagers. They saw him sitting there, and one of them nudged his friend, pointing and laughing. "Look at that guy. He probably thinks we're going to give him money." Arthur's heart sank. It wasn't the mocking laughter that stung. It was the sheer disregard, the casual cruelty. It was as if he were invisible, an object of ridicule, a problem to be ignored. But just as his resolve was starting to waver, something unexpected happened. A small, weathered car pulled up across the street. The engine sputtered before it cut off, and a woman in her 60s stepped out. Her clothes were simple and unassuming, her hair a mix of gray and white, tied loosely back in a bun. Her shoes were old, but her steps were steady. She crossed the street slowly, deliberately, and Arthur's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't avoiding him like the others. She was coming toward him. "Are you all right?" she asked gently, her voice carrying a warmth that surprised him. She wasn't patronizing or judgmental. She spoke as if she truly cared. Arthur looked up, his throat tight, trying to hold back the emotions that were suddenly flooding him. "I'm just trying to get by," he replied, his voice shaky. The woman nodded as though she understood, reaching into her purse and pulling out a few crumpled bills. "It's not much," she said, holding them out to him, "but I hope it helps. No one should be out here like this." Arthur stared at the money in her hand, but it wasn't the money that moved him. It was the kindness in her eyes, the genuine concern. No one had treated him like this all day, not the businessmen who had passed by, not the jogger, not even the teenagers who had laughed at him. But this woman, with so little, had given him so much more. Empathy, dignity, and a reminder of the kindness that still existed in the world. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The woman smiled and nodded, her eyes warm. "Take care of yourself, dear. Don't give up on the kindness of people." She walked away, and for the first time that day, Arthur didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, but just as he began to reflect on the moment, another familiar figure appeared. Maria, his longtime housekeeper, stood in front of him, her eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Kingston, is that you?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. Arthur froze. He hadn't expected anyone he knew to recognize him, let alone Maria, who had worked for him for years. But she was sharp, and it didn't take her long to piece it together. "Mr. Kingston," she started, her voice soft but full of concern. But she didn't scold him, didn't question his motives. Instead, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a few dollars, and knelt beside him. "You never know what people are going through," she said quietly. "But if you can help, you should. That's what my mother always taught me. Kindness doesn't cost anything." Arthur was speechless. He had so much: wealth, status, power, and yet it was these simple, selfless acts of kindness that had truly shaken him. He had spent years accumulating material wealth, but he had never truly understood the richness of humanity until this moment. "Thank you, Maria," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I think I've learned more today than I have in years." Maria smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Sometimes we all need a reminder." As Arthur walked back into his mansion, the world outside felt different. He had come out to test a theory, to learn how the world treated the poor, but in the end, he had learned something far more profound. The real wealth didn't lie in his mansion or his bank account. It lay in moments of genuine connection, in the quiet power of kindness, in the humility of recognizing our shared humanity. From that day forward, Arthur Kingston vowed to live differently. He could not change the world overnight, but he could make a difference in his own way, by using his influence not just for business success, but to promote compassion, to remind others that wealth, true wealth, was not measured in money, but in the kindness we share. And as he sat in his grand study that night, gazing out over the city, Arthur knew one thing for certain. The greatest treasure he had found that day was the kindness of those who had nothing to give, but everything to offer.